All right, this lecture is going to pick up where we left off, and we're going to be covering the last few battles of the war. So the first battle we're going to talk about is Gettysburg. Right before Gettysburg, the Confederacy is going to suffer a terrible loss. They're going to lose Stonewall Jackson. He is out scouting at a former Union site after a smaller battle, and he's coming back towards his troops at sunset. And because the sun is setting, his troops can't see who's coming towards them, and so they shoot. They accidentally shoot Jackson in the arm, and he has to have his arm amputated. That later gets infected, and because of that, his immune system is weak, and so he catches pneumonia and dies 8 days later. So right off the bat, major Confederate blow. At the same time, Lee is ready to invade the Union. He wants to invade Pennsylvania because his army is really short on supplies. And on top of that, Lee understands that a victory on Northern soil would really force Lincoln to accept Confederate independence. So he's really killing two birds in one stone with this one. So in mid-June of 1863, Lee starts heading north, and on June 28th, Lincoln, he's going to appoint General Meade as the general-in-chief of the army. And so we have a picture of Meade right over here. At this point in time, Lincoln has gone through a few generals. We had General Burnside after McClellan, and then we have a couple generals even after that before we finally get to General Meade. And so on July 1st, we have rebel soldiers who are in the Union. They're looking for supplies, one of that being shoes. And while they're looking for these things, they stumble across Union troops at Gettysburg. And so General Meade and General Lee, they say, all right, we found him, so troops meet up, we're ready to go to battle. So looking at the actual battle, the first day of the battle, which was on July 1st, was a victory for the Confederacy. The Union troops, they start retreating toward Cups Hill and Cemetery Hill, which is right over here. Sorry, right over here. So Union troops are going this way. The Confederate troops, they're following them, forcing them back. And at this point, Lee is considering his options. He knows that Meade's men are strongly positioned, and rather than go around and turn their flank, they would rather attack first. So at this point, Lee is really starting to take the initiative. He wants to be the one to attack. So the next day of battle, July 2nd, a Confederate general is going to attack the Union's left. So now the Confederacy is coming around on this side, and they almost capture where the Union is stationed. So they're working towards Little Round Top, and the Confederacy is almost successful in taking that over, but the second day ends up ending in a stalemate. They aren't completely successful. So then on the next day, July 3rd, Lee is going to launch a main attack on the Union center. And so he's trying to take the Union head on. However, the Union, they're just mowing down the Confederacy with fire after fire. And so Lee loses 6,500 men in less than an hour. So it's a major Confederate blow. And so with this, the Union is victorious, the Confederacy loses, and so Lee is forced to retreat back into Virginia, where he's really starting to feel defeated. He feels like a failure. He tries to offer his resignation to President Davis, but Davis is going to say, nah, dude, just get your act together. We're going to be okay. So looking into the results of Gettysburg and determining whether or not it was a major turning point in the war. So Gettysburg, again, major defeat for the Confederacy, and Lee would never again be strong enough to launch another northern invasion. So that's going to be the important thing that comes out of his defeat, and that he was already low on supplies. So now with this defeat, he's kind of at a loss. So General Meade, despite Lincoln's urgings, he's also unable to follow up on his victory. So it's a Union win, but they aren't able to chase Lee any further. So looking at, is this going to be a major turning point in the war? So first off, we do have to mention again that the invasion of Gettysburg was initially for supplies. Lee did not plan an attack at this point. His soldiers just needed more materials, and he knew that he could get these materials in Union factories. And so when he got there, it was convenient enough for him to attack, so let's go for it. Let's try and win a victory. And so with that, if Lee had been successful, Gettysburg would have been a pathway straight to Washington, D.C. So if the Confederacy would have been successful, then Lee could have had the Union capital. There are some arguments, though, that if Lee had won, he might have been forced to retreat, but if he would have been quick enough to get on the railroad, then he would have had a clear shot to taking over the Union's capital in D.C. So after the Battle of Gettysburg, Lincoln travels to the battle site to give the Gettysburg Address. So this is a few months later in November. This is after all of the bodies have been buried. And so because we had so many losses, it was the bloodiest battle of the entire war. We have to bury all of the bodies, and Lincoln decides that we have to pay respect for all the men who lost their lives there. And so in November, Lincoln travels to the battle site with an orator, Edward Everett. And so Everett's going to be the main dude speaking at the Gettysburg Address. Lincoln, he's only asked to give a few words, a few appropriate remarks, and so Lincoln's speech is only 272 words compared to Everett's 2-hour speech. And so with that, we've got a picture of Lincoln right here. This is a picture that's only come out in the past couple of years just because Lincoln spoke so fast that everyone was kind of like, oh, wait, he's done? So we've got this blurry picture of Lincoln just because his speech was so short. So looking into a next major battle, how did Grant capture Vicksburg? So remember, Vicksburg is going to be important because it's holding together the two sides of the Confederate Army. And so in April of 1863, Grant is going to start marching down the west side of the Mississippi. And Grant, he wants to defeat the two rebel armies separately, and so we're going to have a battle, or a capture, I should say, at Vicksburg, and then a battle at Jackson. And so Grant, he defeats Confederate General Johnston at Jackson pretty quickly, and then he's forcing the Confederate General Pemberton to retreat into the town of Vicksburg. And so Grant is able to capture the town. He starves the town out, and so they run out of supplies. They are forced to surrender just because people are literally dying of starvation. And with this victory, it happens on July 4th. So this is the same time as Gettysburg. So at the same time, we have massive blows to the Confederate Army, one being at Gettysburg, and then two being the loss of Vicksburg. And so with the Union's with their success at Vicksburg, the Confederate Army is now cut in two. And we can see here the town of Vicksburg, and then you've got Grant. Everybody celebrating their capture of the town. So looking into what are General Grant's plans? So in March of 1864, Lee appoints Grant as the General-in-Chief of all Union armies. So Grant's plan is going to be for the Army of the Potomac to attack Lee. So the main army, they're attacking Lee, defeating Lee. And then Sherman, he's going to be our next main guy. He's going to be in charge of all command in the West. And so his job is going to be to capture Atlanta. You're going to have other generals who have other specific jobs as far as threatening Richmond, but Grant and Sherman are going to be our main guys. And so Lincoln is going to be really happy about this. He's going to claim that this is what he wanted right from the start of the war. So looking into the Atlanta campaign, in May of 1864, Sherman and 100,000 men start heading towards Atlanta. And so Davis is going to be a little upset because his general is going to retreat instead of going the offensive. So Sherman is coming towards him, he's going to retreat. And Sherman is able to turn Johnston's flank. And so again, he's just pushing Johnston further and further back. And so David, he gets fed up with this. He says, no, you really need to attack. So he says, Johnston, get out of there. I'm going to replace you with John Bell Hood. And so Hood's going to be known as a brave fighter, but his skill as a commander, not as strong. And so we have a series of attacks on Union lines, and it ultimately results in the Confederate losing 20,000 men. And so with the Union victory, Hood is forced to abandon Atlanta, and this results in a Union victory. So looking into the election of 1864, so this election was going to be the Confederacy's last hope in a Confederate victory and gaining their independence, because they knew if Lincoln was to be reelected that he would continue the war, and they were not in a strong suit at this point. They just suffered two major losses in a year before, with losing Gettysburg, losing Vicksburg, so they really needed another president who would say, all right, just let the South do their thing. And so the election came down to Lincoln as the Republican candidate and then McClellan as the Democratic candidate. And remember, McClellan, he was a dude that Lincoln just fired, the guy who was always indecisive, always sure that Lee had more men than him, so he's going to decide to run against Lincoln. What the Democrats wanted was negotiated peace, so Democrats said, all right, we've fought enough, we need to end this war, let's have a talk, let's let the South be their own country. The Republicans, on the other hand, they want unconditional surrender and an end of slavery by constitutional amendment. So the Republicans, they're ready to continue fighting the war. The Democrats, they're like, no, we need to put an end to this fast. And so it was really up in the air as far as which way this was going to go until September, when the war is going to start to turn in Lincoln's favor. So we have an important naval victory, we have the fall of Atlanta, and so with this, it really looks like the Union can be successful in winning this war. And so with that, Lincoln is able to win 55% of the popular vote, and he's able to get reelected. And we can take a look at the graph over here. So the only parts of the country that are voting are the blue and the red parts. The blue is where Lincoln wins, and the red is where McClellan wins. So McClellan gets a couple of border states. He gets one border state, but the majority is going to go to Lincoln. And then, of course, the South is not voting because they're not part of the country at the moment. And then we have the territories, they're not voting either. So looking into what is Sherman doing, what is Sherman's march to the sea? So Sherman is leaving for Atlanta in November of 1864, and he's going to march through from Georgia to Savannah. And with this, his goal is to demoralize the South, so destroy homes, destroy railroads, destroy supplies, and destroy the Confederacy's will to fight. And so at this point, the Confederacy is not in a position to stop the Union troops, and the Union is successful in capturing Savannah in December, so just 1 month later. On this 285-mile march, $100 million is damaged in Georgia, and another important thing is that this is also going to show the Confederate government can't protect its people. So Sherman is destroying supplies, he's destroying morale, showing the people that you can't be protected anymore. This is starting to become a civilian problem as well. So leading up to Lee's surrender, what's going to cause him to surrender? So at this point, Lee is given command of all Confederate armies, and the Union is going to capture the last major Confederate port. And in February 1865, Sherman is going to start heading towards South Carolina. So Lee orders Johnston to resist Sherman's march toward Richmond, saying, you got to stop this dude, we got to put an end to this. However, Johnston's troops are small and they're half-starved, so they're not going to be very successful in stopping Sherman. April 2nd, General Grant is going to order a full-scale assault, and he breaks through Lee's lines. And so Lee is forced to abandon Richmond, and now the Confederate capital falls to the Union. So we've got the Confederate's capital at this point. Things are not looking good for the Confederacy. So Lee starts heading west, and he's hoping to join up with Johnston, but instead he is surrounded by Union forces. And on April 6th, Lee is fighting his last battle at Sailor's Creek. He achieves nothing, however, except for the loss of 8,000 men. And so a few days later, on April 9th, Lee realizes that the fight is over. And a day later, on April 10th, Lee and Grant, they meet at the Appomattox Courthouse. At the Appomattox Courthouse, and this is where Lee is given his surrender to General Grant. So we got the two here. There's Grant, there's Lee, going over terms of the surrender. Looking at, was this the end of the Confederacy? Of course we know it is, but Davis, he's not willing to accept this right away. President Davis is going to flee south, and he's trying to encourage the Confederacy to fight on. But the Southerners, they really have no interest in guerrilla warfare tactics. Couple days later, April 16th, Johnston formally surrenders to General Sherman. May 10th, Davis is captured in Georgia. And a fun fact, the last skirmish in the war is fought in Texas on May 13th, and it's ironically a rebel victory. And we will stop here.